না না এটা বিধান মানা না এ ঠান্ডা মানে
Okay, all right. Welcome back to our online session. So as I said, today we shall do final block, that is block 4 of ENM 6115, British fiction, and this is the last lecture of this session, and we shall focus on uh, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Have you heard about this novel before? Hello, Mamita? Have you heard about this novel, Robinson Crusoe, in your BA or something? Okay.
The in
All
past
right.
semester.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Robinson Crusoe is not just a adventure novel or story. It is one of the earliest English novels that marks as an important stage in the development of realistic prose fiction in English literature. Okay, so the novel was first published in the year in like 1719, most probably. At that time, English readers were interested in real life experiences rather than fantasy or romance. So therefore, presents the story as a personal life narrative. Narrative here means story, right? Written in the form of an autobiography. So this literary technique makes the story sound like truthful and convincing. So readers feel that Crusoe is a real man describing his own struggles, like failures and achievements. So as students of literature, English literature, you must understand why this novel is included in your syllabus. Okay, so Robinson Crusoe reflects what the social and intellectual spirit of the 18th century. So it highlights ideas such as like individual effort, hard work, self-discipline, faith in God, and economic independence. So these ideas were becoming very important during this period. Okay, so before we proceed to next, let's move on to the lecture contents. So lecture, now let us clearly look at this so that we can clearly understand what we are going to do step by step in this lecture. First, recap of the previous lectures and then today's focus areas and then learning goals and in-depth discussion of unit 6 into 20 of block 4 Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, and then assignment questions, and finally conclusion of the lecture. Okay, so now next, and here you see left side you see recap of previous lecture, and then the other side you see today's focus. There is on block 4, Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe. So in the previous block, what have we discussed in the previous class about ENM forces passage to India? So where we discuss about British colonial rule in India and also complex relationship between British and Indians. So the novel focuses on misunderstanding, racial tensions, and a failure of friendship under control, colonial conditions. I think I have already discussed about this. So today we shall focus on Robinson Crusoe. So here, this blog is quite important, because why? It introduces you to one of the earliest and also most influential, English novels. So this blog is divided into 5 units, right? So from 16 to 20. So each unit, has a clear academic purpose. Remember what I mean by that. Okay, so you can see Unit 16 gives you a general introduction to the novel, right? And Unit 18, sorry 17 and unit 17 deals with uh, you know Robinson Crusoe as a novel or narrative, right? And unit 18, 19, and 20 deals with summary and analysis of the novel in three parts, right? We shall discuss them critically and broadly later in the lecture. So before that, let's move on to learning goals. So here you can see course objectives and expected outcomes. So the first objective is to understand what the role of Daniel Defoe in the rise of English novel. Before before English prose narratives were mainly romances or translations. So Defoe, Daniel Defoe introduced realism by focusing on ordinary life, personal experiences, and practical actions. So Robinson Crusoe is a key example of this shift or change. And the second objective is to identify the major themes of the novel. So these novels include survival, like self-reliance, faith in God, discipline, and labor, honor, and you are expected not only to like these themes, but also explain the reference and experiences in the novel. So another important objective is to explain Robinson Crusoe as correct and realistic narrative. And finally, also aims the course also aims to help you, right, relate the novel to its colonial, economic, and religious context. So you see, literature and this novel reflects 18th century European values. Okay, so something like that. So learning goals, expected outcomes now. So now, why are we doing this? Why these learning goals are important? Course objectives and course outcomes. So now, what is the importance of course outcomes? So if you course outcomes explain what you should be able to do after completing these units or mention Crusoe. Okay, that's why it's very important. So first, you should be so as you can see in the first point. First, you should be able to critically analyze Robinson Crusoe as an early work of in British fiction, right? So what is it? Critical analysis mean going beyond summary. You must be able to explain how the novel is written, what ideas it promotes, and what is important in literary history. Okay, so second is you should be able to discuss important themes such as individualism, survival, religious belief, and colonial ideology. So you must learn to connect these themes with specific events in the novel, such as Crusoe's island life, his labor and his relationship with Friday. Friday is the name, correct the name. I will come to this particular character later. Okay, so another important outcome is the ability to write, well structured and coherent answers, right? So these include like writing in clear, introduction, logically arranged body paragraphs, okay, and brief conclusions. So now next is you're also expected to use textual references, especially in exam when you answer the questions. If possible, you go to try to use textual, references, while answering the questions. So this doesn't mean that you memorizing quotation from the text, no, not like that, but clearly referring to incidents like ideas from the text. Okay, that's why in that way, references will strengthen your arguments. Okay, so next is uh, this outcome also helps you prepare effectively, using your SLM. You have already got the SLM, right? Mamita, have you got your SLM?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, based on your SLM, effectively, you help you prepare effectively for SLM based examination. Everything will be based on SLM. Okay, nothing will come beyond SLM. Whatever you have got all the SLM, right? All the 5 SLMs for your MA course. So all the questions will come from that SLM, those SLMs, not beyond that. Okay, that's why I encourage you to go through the SLMs, and then there are some questions right in the SLM. Go through them, solve them. Okay, if you have any problem, you let me know. I can help you with that. Okay.
Mm.
So next, now let's move on to the first unit of this, block. That is unit 16, Robinson Crusoe and introductions. So now we begin this unit. So this unit introduces what Robinson Crusoe is a novel, right, or one of the earliest novel of English literature. So this unit is very important because it gives you the basic foundation needed to understand the entire text on Robinson Crusoe. So Robinson Crusoe was published in the year what? I have already said when I introduced this Robinson Crusoe. It is in 1719, right? It is widely regarded as one of the first English novels. Okay, so Daniel Defoe wrote it at a time when prose fiction, in English was still developing. So the novel is written in the form of fictional autobiography. So this means Crusoe tells his story, his own life story in the first person narrative. Defoe uses this method, this technique to make the narrative sound truthful and realistic. That's how readers feel that Crusoe is a real person describing his real experiences. So this narrative technique was new and effective during the 18th century. So the novel was inspired by the real-life story of Alexander Selkirk, a sailor who survived alone on an island for several years. So Defoe used this idea but expanded it into a comprehensive story, like detailed story about survival, discipline, and personal growth. So how Robinson Crusoe is not simply a survival, tale or story. It reflects thinking and values of early 18th century Europe. Okay, so the novel was as you can see in this unit, the novel also introduces themes such as adventures. These are the major themes, okay, such as adventures, survival, faith in God, self-reliance, and hard work. Remember these themes, okay? And Crusoe believes that human effort and discipline can overcome difficult situations, any kind of difficult situations. So he also gradually develops religious faith, which becomes, an important part of his life on the island. So this unit helps you understand why Robinson Crusoe is considered as a landmark text. It marks a shift change from imaginative romance to what, realistic prose fictions. So students of literature, we should remember all these points. Okay, otherwise how will you write in exams, or how will you express to other people, students of literature? You maybe in future we have to teach about this. How will you teach or share about this? So as a students of literature, you must remember all these things. Okay, next we have the context and significance of Robinson Crusoe. Now let's discuss this. So understanding the background of the novel helps you explain why it became so popular, right, and why it holds an important place in literary history. So the novel was written during a period when the middle class in England was growing rapidly, very fast. So these English readers were interested in practical life, trouble, trade, and personal success. Okay, so trouble literature and sea advances narratives were very popular during this period or this time. So accounts of voyages like shipwreck. Do you know shipwreck? We don't call it ship accident, right? Huh? It is shipwrecked, and distant lands attracted readers. So Daniel Defoe used these influences to shape Robinson Crusoe. However, instead of presenting a heroic fantasy, he focused on realistic details like farming, building shelter, making tools, and managing resources. So another important aspect of this novel, novel's context is the emphasis on like practical knowledge and experiences, and Crusoe survives not because of luck or magic, okay, but because of planning, patience, and continuous labor. So this reflects the values of emerging capitalist society, where hard work and discipline were highly respected. So the novel also has a strong economic significance. So Crusoe treats the island as his personal property. He measures land, controls resources, and believes in ownership. So this attitude reflects early ideas of economic individualism and capitalism. So these ideas were becoming influential in 18th century Europe. Okay, so and the novel also reflects the colonial thinking. So Crusoe assumed that cultural superiority over others, like uh, and believes he has the right to control the land and people he encounters. So this makes the novel important for understanding colonial ideology. So by learning and the context and significance of Robinson Crusoe, you can understand each themes and relevance in a better way. Okay, so next let's move on to the next unit, that is on the Robinson Crusoe as a picaresque novel. What is it? So before so you here you must first understand what is, not you, we all must understand what a picaresque novel means first at first. So a picaresque novel usually presents the life story of hero who moves from one situation to another and learns through experience rather than formal educations. So the story progresses through episodes instead of a tightly planned plot. So this novel, Robinson Crusoe, follows the same pattern clearly. And Crusoe's life is shown as a series of adventures and hardships. He faces storms, at sea, and then shipwreck, slavery, escaped, plantation life, and finally, complete isolation of the island. And each experience, teaches him a lesson and shapes his character. So the focus is not on society as a whole, but on the individual journey of the hero. Okay, so Crusoe can be described as a self-made man. He survived through his own effort, planning, and discipline. His success, comes from learning by doing. This emphasis on experience is a key features of the picaresque traditions or style. So unlike traditional heroes, Crusoe is not noble or heroic by birth. He becomes successful through struggle. Okay, so however, Robinson Crusoe is different from earlier Picaresque novels. It contains less humor and social satire, and instead it focuses more on personal struggle, more reflection, and religious thinking. Uh, Crusoe often reflects on his actions, sees his suffering as a form of punishment or divine testing. So This, unit 17 actually helps you understand the structure of the novel. Okay, now let's move on to the summary and analysis of part 1. Uh,
Cruise.
in this part, the focus is on Crusoe early's life and the choices that lead to his suffering. Crusoe disobeys his parents, who advise him to lead a stable and comfortable life. Instead, he is attracted to the sea and adventures. So this act of disobedience is very important because it sets the direction of the entire, novel. Crusoe repeatedly ignores, warnings and follows his desire for trouble and profit. As a result, he faces a series of misfortunes. He experiences, shipwrecked and eventually captured and enslaved. And these events, shows how risky and unstable his chosen life is. So, and after escaping the slavery, Crusoe reaches Brazil and becomes a plantation owner. Right? He also became plantation owner, and for some time his life improves and gains economic success. And however, his desire for more wealth pushes him back into dangerous voids. So this shows his restless nature and strong beliefs in economic gain. So this is the turning point of this unit. That is the final shipwreck where which leaves Crusoe completely alone on a deserted or isolated island. So this moment marks the beginning of his long isolation and struggle for survival. Everything familiar to him is taken away, and he must depend only on himself. Okay, so from an analytical point of view, this part of the novel introduces the theme of suffering as transformation. Okay, so Crusoe's hardship struggle slowly forces him to reflect his life choices. So this unit 18, actually prepares the ground for his moral, psychological, and spiritual development in the later parts of the novel. So now let's see what happened in the unit 19. So here, this unit mainly focuses on Crusoe's long life on the deserted island. So Crusoe, lives on the island like for about 28 years, and this period becomes the most important stage of his personal transformations. So at the beginning, just a moment. Uh, at the beginning, what he feels fear and lonely and despair, but gradually he learns how to survive through planning and hard work. Crusoe also begins by building a shelter to protect himself from weather and dangers. Right. He then starts growing crops, domesticating animals, and making tools for daily use. Where where he's stranded in the deserted island, right? That place. So every small achievements give him confidence and teaches him the value of patience and discipline. So his survival depends entirely on his labor and careful use of resources. Another important aspect of this part is Crusoe's growing religious faith. Alone on the island, he begins to reflect deeply on his past actions. He reads the Bible, the Holy Bible regularly, and believes that God has punished him for his earlier disobedience. So over time, his faith gives him mental strength and emotional stability. Crusoe also maintains a journal in which he records, daily events and personal thoughts. This habit shows his personal psychological development through writing. He learns to control, fear and organize his life systematically. Okay, so the journal reflects the journal here, right? That reflects how suffering leads to to self-awareness. So this part of the novels presents the idea of human control over nature. So Crusoe reshapes the island according to his needs. So these units highlight themes such as survival. There are many themes I have mentioned, right? So here, there are specific focus themes here, such as like survival, labor, discipline, faith, and individualism. So these ideas are central to understanding Robinson Crusoe as an early realistic novel. Okay, so now let's see what in the unit 20 here. This unit introduces new characters and brings the narrative towards its conclusion. One of the most important development in this part is Crusoe's encounter with cannibals who visited the deserted island. Okay, this encounters increases his fear, but also strengthen his sense and authority over the island. Crusoe eventually rescue a native prisoner from the cannibals and names him Friday. Okay, Friday is a name, character name, who Crusoe rescued from those cannibals. So the act of naming itself shows what? The act of naming itself in English name, right? The act of naming him in English, that is Friday, that name itself shows Crusoe's sense of control and ownership. So Crusoe teaches Friday his language, religions, customs, and also expect complete obedience from him. So their relationship clearly reflects as a master servant structure. So who is the master here? Robinson Crusoe, and servant Friday, something like that. So this relationship reveals the colonial mindset present in the novel. So Crusoe assumes cultural and moral superiority and believes that it is his duty to civilize Friday. This reflects European colonial ideology of the 18th century. Now, as students of English literature, you must observe this aspect carefully. Okay, as it is often discussed in the critical interpretation of the novel. So later in the story, Crusoe helps defeat mutineers and finally secure his rescue. And after many years of isolation in that isolated island, he returns to England. There, he discovers that his plantation has made him wealthy. However, the importance of this ending is not like only material success. So what happened then? Kurosu returns to his homeland, right? Returns as a changed man. His long experiences, completes his long experience on the island has taught him discipline, patience, belief, and self-control. So this unit, completes his journey from rebellion to reflections. It brings together the themes of colonialism, authority, survival, and transformation, making the novel as a complete and meaningful story. Now next is major themes of Robinson Crusoe. Now let's focus on the major themes of the major themes. The first theme is the first major theme is individualism and self-reliance. So Crusoe survives on the island through his own effort, planning, and discipline. Right? So he depends on no one else, and learns to solve problems independently. This reflects the 18th century beliefs in the power of individuals. Another important theme is the survival of man versus nature. Right? The island represents a hostile natural environment, and Crusoe must struggle continuously to stay alive. So through farming, in building, tool making, he gradually gained control over nature. So this thing shows how human intelligence and labor as tools for survival. So religion and dependence from another major thing. Crusoe believes that his suffering is a punishment from God for disobeying his parents. Over time, religious faith becomes a source of comfort and strength for him. His prayers, Bible reading help him accept his conditions and find meaning in suffering. So and colonialism and imperial ideology also the central themes of this novel. So Corozo treats the island as his property and assumes authority over Friday. He believes that European culture is superior and feels justified in ruling others. So this reflects the colonial mindset of Defoe's time. So labor, capitalism, and ownership form another major theme or key theme of the novel. So Crusoe values hard work, productivity, and economic gain. So he measures land, store resources, and treat laborers as morally important. So this theme shows how the novel reflects early capitalist values. So altogether, these themes explain why Robinson Crusoe's like modern and adventurous story or narrative. So they make it like an important. These things, combined, make it an important social and cultural, cultural, like record or document of its time, like like which is still relevant even today, right? So now let's move on to assignment questions. So these questions are mainly to see how much you understood on this block 4, this lecture, right? So go through these questions, try to solve them. Okay. So the first question is Robinson Crusoe as an early realistic novel, and the second question is about Robinson Crusoe's island life as a symbol of human survival and discipline. And the last question is on colonial relationship between Crusoe and Friday. So now so we now let's move on to the conclusion. So here in this block, we have seen how Daniel Defoe is the pioneers modern English modern English fiction, right? Like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as a landmark test in the history of English literature. So because it is considered as the earliest English novels and plays a major role in the development of realistic prose fiction. So through this novel, Daniel Defoe moves away from romance and fantasy and focuses on everyday experience and practical life, right? And the novel also combines adventures with realism. How as you can see, Crusoe's journey, right, is not only physical but also moral and psychological. His experiences of like suffering, like labor, fate, and reflection transform him as a person. So the novel also reflects an important 18th century values such as individual effort, discipline, economic independence, and religious belief. So at the same time, uh, we saw that Robinson clearly reflects colonial and imperial ideologies. Like you see, Crusoe attitudes towards the island and towards Friday shows European assumptions of superiority and control. Okay, so this makes the novel important for understanding the historical roots of colonial thinking. So With this, we conclude, the Block-4 ENM 6115, and also the course ENM, and also the conclusion of, ENM 6115 British fiction. So if you have, any doubts, questions on this, of this lecture, of this blog, you may, ask me, you may send me over, email or WhatsApp, and try to solve all the, questions that have been given to you as a part of assignments, and wish you best of luck for your upcoming. Thank you so much.